How Theosophy Came to Me by C.W. Leadbeater. Chapter 2, The Occult World. I've already mentioned that the first theosophical book which fell into my hands was Mr. A.P. Sinnett's The Occult World. I saw it advertised in a catalog of second-hand books and was much attracted by the title. So I sent for it immediately and was fortunate enough to secure it. Naturally, the stories which it contains interested me deeply, but its real fascination lay in the glimpses which it gave of a wonderful system of philosophy and of a kind of inner science, which really seemed to explain life rationally and to account for many phenomena which I had observed. I was, of course, eager to learn very much more of this, but I was so entirely unused to the ways of the literary world that I did not know in the least how to set about obtaining further information. With the benefit of later experience, I can see now that it would have been simple to write a note to the author and send it to the care of his publishers. But such a solution of the difficulty did not occur to me. At the end of his book, Mr. Sinnett remarks, "Some readers who are interested but slow to perceive what practical action they can take may ask what they can do to show appreciation of this opportunity. My reply will be modeled on the famous injunction of Sir Robert Peel: register, register, register. Take the first few steps towards making a response to the offer which emanates from the occult world. Register, register, register." In other words, join the Theosophical Society, the one and only association which at present is linked by any recognized bond of union with the Brotherhood of Adepts in Tibet. I was most anxious to follow this advice, but found it by no means easy to do so. The author mentioned that there was a Theosophical Society in London, but did not give its address, and I sought for it in vain in the post office directory. I made many inquiries among friends, but did not happen to find anyone who could help me in my quest. Shortly after that, however, I was in Scotland, inquiring into the evidence for second sight in the Highlands, and apparently, by merest chance, and then he says in brackets, "but I doubt whether anything ever happens by chance," close bracket, I found on the table in the reading room of the hotel a copy of a tiny spiritualistic magazine, hardly more than a leaflet. I think it was called Rays of Light, or some such name like that. In it was an announcement referring to Dr. Anna Kingsford, president of the London Lodge of the Theosophical Society, and stating that she was the wife of the rector or vicar of some West Country village or town. I think the name was Atcham, Atcham. Naturally, I seized upon this clue and at once wrote to her at the vicarage, asking for further information. It was some time before I received a reply, for, as it transpired afterwards, Dr. Kingsford was away on the continent for a holiday, and even when it arrived, it proved to be only a printed circular. Excuse me, very beautifully printed, however, with much of silver about it, but it gave me the information which I wanted, the address of the secretary in London, and it further told me that in order to join the society, I must be proposed and seconded by 2 members. The secretary was Mr. Kirby, not the Mr. Kirby, so well known in later years in connection with the Society's work in Italy, but the Kirby of Kirby and Spence's Entomology, a book which I had studied in my boyhood. I promptly wrote to him, pointing out that I wished to join, but had not the pleasure of the acquaintance of any of the existing members. What was I to do? Again, I had to wait a long time for an answer, for Mr. Kirby was also abroad. I think he was climbing peaks in Switzerland. But at length he replied austerely that the rules were inviolable and that no exception could be made. But he suggested as an afterthought that I might call upon either Mr. A.P. Sinnett or Mr. G. B. Finch. I adopted this suggestion and wrote a note to Mr. Sinnett, hardly daring, however, to hope that he could really be the author of the book which had impressed me so deeply. His reply soon set that point at rest, and invited me to come up to London to see him. I had only recently returned from India and was staying temporarily at the house of his mother-in-law, Mrs. Edensor, Edensor, in Royal Crescent, Notting Hill. He received me with the greatest kindness and cordiality, and of course we talked much of his books, for by this time I had found esoteric Buddhism also, and the wonderful revelation which they contained. The more I heard of Theosophy, the more anxious I became to learn all that could be told to me. But when I spoke of joining the Theosophical Society, Mr. Sinnett became very grave and opined that that would hardly do, seeing as I was a clergyman. I wondered rather why the society should discriminate against members of the cloth, and at last I ventured timidly to put the question. Mr. Sinnett replied, "Well, you see, we're in the habit of discussing every subject and every belief from the beginning without any preconceptions whatsoever, and I'm afraid that our meetings you would be likely to hear a great deal that would shock you profoundly." I had already, years previously, attended some of Mrs. Besant's lectures at the Hall of Science in Old Street, off the City Road, and I thought that after that, nothing that the members of the Theosophical Society could say would be likely to offend me very seriously. So, smilingly, I assured Mr. Sinnett that I hoped I was not that kind of clergyman, and that I should be quite prepared to join any discussion that might arise, irrespective of the beliefs of the debaters. At this, Mr. Sinnett partially thawed, and even said that if that were really the case, he would have peculiar pleasure in admitting a clergyman, but that before taking so decided a step he must consult his counsel. So we had to leave it at that, and I returned to my country curacy, Curacy, 50 miles away in Hampshire. Within a week, however, I had a letter from Mr. Sinnett saying that the majority of the council had agreed to my admission, and that if I would fill the necessary forms, he would be glad to propose me himself. And he further advised me to call upon Mr. G. B. Finch, who would probably second my application if I impressed him favorably. Mr. Finch proved to be just as kindly as Mr. Sinnett, and I was presently notified that I was at last accepted as a member of the society, and that if I would call at his house on a certain evening, I might be initiated. By that time, Mr. Sinnett had moved into a house of his own in Ladbroke, Ladbroke, Ladbroke Gardens, and thither I duly repaired at the appointed time. I found that I was to be initiated into the mysteries of the society, along with 2 other applicants, Professor and Mrs. Crooks, and then I realized that the honor of being admitted along with so distinguished a scientist, for though Professor Crooks was not yet Sir William, I knew of him as the discoverer of thallium, the inventor of the radiometer, and the apostle of radiant matter. To join the Theosophical Society was in those days a somewhat formidable undertaking. We found Mrs. Sinnett's large drawing room crowded to excess, the assembly, in fact, overflowing onto the landing and a little way up the staircase. I suppose there may have been some 200 people present, including some who bore very distinguished names, such as Professor Myers, C.C. Massey, Massey, Stainton Moses, and others. We 3 were planted together upon a sofa in the midst of the crowd, and Mr. Sinnett, after delivering a homily on the objects and the work of the society, Julie communicated to us a series of signs and passwords by means of which we were to be able to recognize our fellow members in any part of the world. These signs and words have since dropped into abeyance in most countries, though I think that our president still gives them to any candidates whom she receives in India. After this, I missed very few of the lodge meetings, coming up to London nearly every week. In fact, Mr. Sinnett was so hospitable as to give me a standing invitation to dine and spend the night at his house on these occasions, as I lived 50 miles away. At those dinners and at the meetings which followed, I met many well-known people, and I heard many most interesting and instructive conversations. It must be remembered that all the teaching was at that time quite new to us, that there were many points on which our information was very imperfect, and that consequently there was much room for discussion. The planetary chains, the different planes of nature, and the conditions of consciousness upon each of them, all these things came to us as fresh revelation, and we had no small difficulty in harmonizing the scattered statements made in the replies which had been received to Mr. Sinnett's multifarious questions. The son of our present president had not then risen above the theosophical horizon. Oh, I see. Okay, so it's S-U-N, the sun. Okay, the son of our present president had not yet risen above the theosophical horizon. So we had no one to disentangle the knotted skeins or to bring the apparently conflicting statements into harmony. I remember creating a small sensation at the dinner table by announcing that it seemed to me the obvious course that each of us should set before himself the definite intention of becoming a pupil of one of the great adept masters. The suggestion was apparently somewhat of a shock to those present, for it was received in dead silence. And it was only after an appreciable pause that Mr. Sinnett remarked that he supposed that Europeans could hardly hope for anything of that sort at the present stage of our knowledge, which was true enough, but I thought we might at least set our faces determinedly in that direction. These meetings of the London Lodge were almost our only sources of theosophical information in those days. I think we were an exceptionally keen set of students, but there wasn't really much for us to study. In addition to those two books of Mr. Sinnett's, we had Madame Blavatsky's monumental work, Isis Unveiled, and also a fine book by Dr. Anna Kingsford called The Perfect Way, or The Finding of Christ. This latter book contained a great deal of information, but it was given from a point of view entirely different from that of Mr. Sinnett's books, and for most of us, much more difficult to follow. Isis Unveiled is a vast chaos of most interesting matter, but we found it very difficult to reduce from it anything that could be called a coherent or definite system. But we struggled along as best we could, and a little later we had the great encouragement of hearing that Master Khatumi was pleased with the efforts that we had made, and would send over from India one of his own disciples to help us in our work. This pupil was Mr. Mohini Mohan Chatterjee, Chatterji, a young lawyer from Calcutta, and he reached London along with Colonel Occult early in 1884. I must say that he proved exceedingly helpful to us, and it was from his addresses that we first gained a clear idea of the path of initiation and its requirements. A statement of these in his wording appears on the first page of the celebrated Transactions of the London Lodge. I remember well the occasion of his appearance at one of Mr. Sinnett's evening receptions. Colonel Occult and Mohini stood on the hearth rug in front of the grate, and some 200 people were brought and introduced to them one by one. Among these was the notorious Mr. Oscar Wilde, who always gave one the impression of wishing to be distinctive, in brackets, not to say bizarre, close bracket, both in manners and in dress. On that occasion, I remember he was habited in black velvet with knee breeches and white stockings. He came up to Mohini, was introduced, bowed gracefully, and in retiring said in a very audible stage whisper to Mr. Sinnett, "I never realized before what a mistake we make in being white." Mohini, being a Brahmin, was quite unversed in Western customs, and I believed it caused him acute discomfort to allow that crowd of wine-drinking mlechas to seize him by the hand. He looked very sick, but he endured it nobly, and of course none of us had the least idea of what was the matter. He answered patiently a vast number of what must have seemed to him very foolish and incredibly ignorant questions, and came off with flying colors as the hero of the evening, most of the old ladies regarding him with reverential awe. In the course of my inquiries into spiritualism, I had come into contact with most of the prominent mediums of that day, and had, as I said before, seen every ordinary phenomena about which one reads in books on that subject. One medium with whom I had much to do was Mr. Eglinton, and although I have heard stories against him, I must bear witness that in all my own dealings with him, I found him most straightforward, reasonable, and courteous. He had various so-called controls. One, a red Indian girl who called herself Daisy and chattered volubly on all occasions, appropriate or inappropriate. Another was a tall Arab named Abdullah, and considerably over 6 feet, who never said anything but produced remarkable phenomena and often exhibited feats showing great strength. I've seen him simultaneously lift 2 heavy men, one in each hand. A third control, who frequently put in an appearance, was Ernest. He comparatively rarely materialized, but frequently spoke with direct voice, and wrote a characteristic and well-educated hand. One day, in conversation with him, something was said in reference to the masters of the wisdom. Ernest spoke of them with the most profound reverence, and said that he had, on various occasions, had the privilege of seeing them. I at once inquired whether he was prepared to take charge of any message or letter for them, and he said he would willingly do so, and would deliver it when opportunity offered, but he could not say when that would be. I may mention here that in connection with this, I had later a good example of the unreliability of such communications. Some considerable time afterwards, some spiritualists wrote to Light, L-I-G-H-T, with a capital L, explaining there could not possibly be such persons as the masters, because Ernest had positively told him that there were not. I wrote to that same newspaper to say that I had it on precisely the same valueless authority that there were masters, and that Ernest knew them. In each case, Ernest had evidently reflected the thought of the questioner, as much as such entities often do. To return to my story, I at once provisionally accepted Ernest's offer. I said that I would write a letter to one of the great masters and would confide it to him if my friend and teacher, Mr. Sinnett, approved. At the mention of this name, the spirits were much perturbed. Daisy especially was very angry and declared that she would have nothing to do with Mr. Sinnett under any circumstances. "Why, he calls us spooks," she said, with great indignation. However, I blandly stuck to my point that all I knew of Theosophy had come to me through Mr. Sinnett, and that I therefore did not feel justified in going behind his back in any way, or trying to find some other means of communication without first consulting him. Finally, though, with a very bad grace, the spirits consented to this, and the séance was presently terminated. When Mr. Eglinton came out of his trance, I asked him how I could send a letter to Ernest, and he said at once that if I would let him have the letter, he would put it in a certain box which hung against the wall, from which Ernest would take it when he wished. I then posted off to Mr. Sinnett and asked his opinion of all this. He was at once eagerly interested and advised me promptly to accept the offer and see what happened. And here, the next part of this chapter is entitled A Letter to the Master. Thereupon, I went home and I wrote 3 letters. The first was to Master K.H. Now, I think this would be Master Katumi. Okay, so the first was to Master K.H., telling him with all reverence that ever since I had first heard of Theosophy, my one desire had been to place myself under him as a pupil. I told him of my circumstances at the time, and I asked whether it was necessary that the 7 years of probation of which I had heard should be passed in India. I put my letter in a small envelope and I sealed it carefully with my own seal. Then I enclosed it in a letter to Ernest, in which I reminded him of his promise and asked him to deliver this letter for me and to bring back an answer if there should be one. The second letter I sealed in the same manner as the first, and then I enclosed that in turn with a short note to Eglinton, asking him to put it in his box and let me know whether any notice was taken of it. I had asked a friend who was staying with me to examine the seals of both the letters with a microscope, so that we could see them again, so that if we should see them again, we might know whether anyone had been tampering with them. By return of post, I received a note from Mr. Eglinton, saying that he had duly put the note for Ernest into his box and that it had already vanished, and further that if any reply should come to him, he would at once forward it. A few days later, I received a letter directly in hand, which was unknown to me, and on opening it, I discovered my own letter to Ernest, apparently unopened, the name Ernest on the envelope being crossed out, and my own written underneath it in pencil. My friend and I once more examined the seal with a microscope and were unable to detect any indication whatsoever that anyone had tampered with the letter, and we both agreed that it was quite impossible that it should have been opened. Yet, on cutting it open, I discovered that the letter which I had written to the master had disappeared. All that I found inside was my own letter to Ernest, with a few words in the well-known handwriting of the latter written on its blank page, to the effect that my letter had been duly handed to the great master, and that if in future I should ever be thought worthy to receive an answer, Ernest would gladly bring it to me. I waited some months, but no reply came, and whenever I went to Eglinton's seances and happened to encounter Ernest, I always asked him when I might expect my answer. He invariably said that my letter had been duly delivered, but that nothing had yet been said about an answer, and that he could do no more. 6 months later, I did receive a reply, but not through Ernest, and in it the master said that though he had not received the letter, nor, as he remarked, was it likely that he should, considering the nature of the messenger, he was aware of what I had written, and he now proceeded to answer it. It will be necessary presently to explain what his answer was, and what steps I took in consequence of it. But before I can make that intelligible, I must turn aside to describe some other incidents which had occurred in the meantime, while I was waiting in hope of receiving that reply. And that concludes chapter 2. Okay. Well, I hope you're finding this interesting. I'm certainly finding it interesting. Okay, so till soon.